Okay, I am all set up here to dye. The first thing that you need to know is all of your supplies that you're using to dye needs to be supplies that you only use for dyeing yarn. So anything that you're using, you cannot use again in your kitchen for any food that you're going to eat because the dyes have toxic properties to them and you do not want to be ingesting dye. So like this crock pot that I have, this was an old crock pot and I didn't use it anymore, and so now it's become my dyeing crock pot. And I like doing the dyeing with the crock pot because I can set stuff in here, I can set a timer for 20 minutes and then I can go walk away and do something else versus trying to watch something on the stove. You have to kind of babysit it a little bit more. So what I have here is a crock pot, so a slow cooker of some sort. I keep an apron. It's usually not super messy, but I do have an apron I just use for dyeing. I have some metal tongs so I can pull the yarn out of here. Once it's done, there's the lid to the crock pot. You can see I have some measuring cups and they are labeled dye, and I keep them with all my dye supply. So I don't accidentally use these in the kitchen, but you wanna make sure you don't. I have my dyes here. I'm using the Jacquard acid dyes. I find they have really good color penetration and it lasts throughout washes, and they're just beautiful colors and they're easy to work with. And so I have my different dyes, and then we use such a small amount of dye that I don't even use the teaspoons. I actually pick up a little bit of dye with this, and I'll show you that. This is just a little coffee stir stick. And then I use that to sprinkle just a little bit of dye onto my yarn. So I'll show you that in the dyeing process. You need citric acid or you need vinegar. So you need some sort of a base where this is going to attach to the yarn, and then that's going to allow the dye to attach onto the yarn. So you need to either use vinegar or citric acid. I like the citric acid because it doesn't have any smell. The vinegar, of course, is going to make your yarn and your house smell like vinegar. So citric acid is my friend. I like it better. I actually use these little shower hooks on the yarn, and I'll show you that. I tie it onto the end of the yarn and it just makes it easier to pull the yarn out of the crock pot once it's all kind of swollen and wet. Some latex or rubber gloves so that you can touch the yarn and stuff and the dye and you're not getting it all over your fingers because it will stain. You need a mask. I actually have a respiration mask. This is just kind of a basic mask, but that'll still work. You probably should wear goggles too, just to protect your eyes, because what you don't want is the powder form of this dye to be getting into your mouth or your eyes. Once it's soaked into the yarn and it's wet and it's soaked in here, it's not a problem anymore. You don't have to worry about all the protective gear. But at the point that it's still a powder, you do need to worry about it. And then I use these little, these are like they're like $5 or even less than that at the grocery stores, these little disposable kind of like aluminum foil pans, and I'll put my yarn in here once I take it out to let it kind of start to cool off, and then I go set it on something where I can like lay it out and let the skein fully dry before I use the yarn in knitting or crochet or anything else. So that is an example of my supplies, and let's get started. The first thing I do is unwind one of these hanks of yarn because you don't want to dye with it all bundled like this. So I unwound this. You're not going to untie the figure eights on the knots. You definitely need to keep those intact until you're ready to wind the yarn. But I at least pull it out like this so it's loose, and then I put one of these shower rings on it, and I do that because once this yarn kind of swells up, and especially if you have multiple skeins in the crock pot, it can be hard to figure out where the separation is between your skeins of yarn. So by having this little shower hook, I can just take my tongs and I can grab the shower hook and pull up, and it's going to pull this isolated skein out of the crock pot for me. So I can put that in here. Usually I'm doing 2 skeins at a time, but I just need 1 to finish up a project that I'm working on. So usually I can fit 2 in here nicely for a dye, but I really only need to dye the 1. So I'm just going to dye the 1. And then we're going to fill this with water, just kind of room temp water, so that it barely comes to the top of the yarn. So just barely needs to get the yarn so the yarn is underwater. So my yarn is in there and it's actually floating on the top. So if you push it down, you can see it start to kind of get under the water. And as it soaks in with the water, it's eventually going to sink and be underneath the water. And then actually a lot of times I add the citric acid when I'm pouring in the water before I add the yarn, but I did not do that yet. So I'm just gonna pour it in now. I don't have any set amount that I use. I mean, I use what, half of probably this, and this is a 1/4 cup. I don't really measure it. You need enough so that it can dissolve into the water, and then it will dissolve into the fibers, and that's what is going to let the dye bind to your fibers. I should also specify that I'm using alpaca yarn. So this is actually an alpaca wool blend, and this is the process for animal fibers. If you're using cotton or plant fibers or synthetic fibers, you have a different process and you have different dyes. So this is only going to apply for your wool, alpaca, rabbit, Angora, so those types of fibers. Okay, so I have it pretty much in there. I could add a little bit more water, so I might grab just a little bit more water, and then we'll get it cooking. Okay, so I need this to be heating for the next 20 minutes. So I'm going to set this, for me, I'm using my high power, and I said 4 hours, but it's not gonna cook for 4 hours. It's only going to cook for about 20 minutes. I need it to get hot. I need the water and the yarn to get hot and absorb in that citric acid, and then after these 20 minutes, we will add the dye. Okay, so my timer went off, and so I am done with soaking this with the citric acid, and now we're ready to add the dye. And because we're working with the dye, I now have on my mask and I have on my gloves, and I am just doing one color for this one. I don't have anything on my hands yet. I'm doing this kind of teal color. Actually, they call it spruce. So it's kind of a bluish color. And I call it a semi-solid because it's only the one color. I kind of spread it throughout the yarn, but you can see there's still a lot of light spots to the yarn. And I intentionally do that because I want it to look hand-dyed. I don't want it to look like some processed yarn that you're buying from a company or a store. I want it to look hand-dyed. But I'm only doing one color versus this yarn up here you can see has two colors. There's a brown and then there's the blue. And I'll show you what that speckle looks like. I'm actually going to be speckling another yarn with some other colors, so I'll show you how we speckle. But right now I'm going to show you this semi-solid look. So because I need so very little dye, I'm actually going to pick it up with a little bit. This is really hard to do one-handed. Usually I've got two hands. Okay, I know I have some on there. And I'm just going to sprinkle it throughout. Okay, I don't have very much in there. See if I can get a little bit more. There we go. Now, if I were just going to speckle color, I would just have small little amounts of dye and I would spread it out just like I'm doing right here. I would have even smaller amounts speckled throughout if I'm trying to get that speckled look on the yarn. And a few things to note, your blues, greens, anything that's going to have an indigo dye to it is going to be darker. It's going to really saturate and take over versus something like your yellows and whatnot. So you want to make sure that if you're doing stuff with blues and greens, that you're not using a ton of color. So you can see it was very little dye. I mean, just like the tiniest little drops. But because I want this to spread throughout the color, I'm actually going to press this down in here with my tongs and get that color all over the yarn. When we're speckling, we just let those little pieces sit on the top of the yarn and just blend in just on that one spot. You don't want to stir or blend at all. But when you're trying to get it to be a solid color yarn, then you need to spread it around and make sure to get it all in there. And I'm probably going to have to add a little bit more dye into this. But once I'm happy with how much dye I have in here, then I will close the lid again and let it cook for another 20 minutes. Okay, Okay, so my 20 minutes are up. There's my yarn with its final color. And usually what I do now is, so that I can find the end, like I said, I grab my ring and then I can pull it out this way. Now I will actually take both my hands and put on my rubber gloves and just squeeze this a little bit to squeeze out some of the water, so I don't have all this water dripping down here. But I can't do that one-handed. So let me do that real quick and I'll show you the rest of this step. So I pulled it out. There's that hook that I used to help pull it out. I kind of squeezed it with my rubber gloves on because it's hot. But you can see, I mean, none of this is going to make any color. This is absorbed into the yarn. I'll just let it sit here a little bit to just kind of cool off and stuff, and then I'll go hang it downstairs and let it dry overnight. But what I want to show you is that my water now is totally clear. See that? Well, okay, so my little scoop had a little bit of dye in it, but the water is clear. There's no dye left. All of the dye has been absorbed. So at this point in time, I could, if I'm done, I can dump this water. I actually dump this outside. I just throw it on the ground. I don't let it doesn't have any more dye. It shouldn't have any more dye, but I don't put it down my septic. So I just dump it outside on the ground, on the dirt. But I'm actually going to just keep using this water and do my second batch. And because I know that I don't have any dye in here, I'm not worried about getting any other colors. Now, sometimes the only place I could have some dye is if some of the powder went up onto the side. So I might do a little wipe just to wipe the side of this and make sure that there's no little pieces of dye on the side, because my colors are not going to be the same for this next batch. And see, when I wipe the inside, that there is a little bit of dye that is somewhere on the walls, because as I wipe, I got a little bit off. So now I think it's pretty clear and I can just keep using this now. So I will add some more citric acid and then I will do my next skein. Okay, so this has cooked for 20 minutes with the citric acid. This is my new skein. There's quite a bit of water. I'm actually going to take a little bit of water out of, well, okay, maybe it's not too bad. I really don't want the water to be over the yarn because I want the little speckled pieces of the dye to sit on the top. I don't want it to blend into the full water. And so I'm actually not going to film this as I speckle the next piece because I really got to be careful with how I do it to make sure that I just get some little dots of yarn through, little dots of dye throughout the yarn. I'll show you what it looks like once I put it on there though. So you can see here I have speckled the first color. Oh, I hope this isn't too orangey. It's supposed to be more pink. It's looking very orange, but we'll see how that kind of turns out. So that's the first color, and now I'm going to come through with a purple hued color, and so I'm going to use even less dye on that because it will really take over on the color. So here's the purple just speckled into some different spots here, and like I said, that's going to really take over and kind of become the dominant color. And then those salmon colors, the salmon color should just kind of highlight in some of the areas, give it a little bit of a pinkish hue on some of the areas. So 20 more minutes. Okay, so 20 minutes later. Ooh, the steam on my camera. 20 minutes later, there's color on this side, but I know that when I go to flip that yarn, there's not really going to be any color on the other side. So what I'm going to do is flip it so that this is upside down, and then I'm going to add dye and color onto the bottom part as well. And what that's going to do is those places where the purple is thicker, it's actually going to spread out and put more of a purple hue overall on the yarn, which is fine. My salmon is going to still kind of be subtle. I ended up adding a lot more salmon and just kind of let it soak into more of the yarn so that the salmon is the dominant on this yarn with the speckling of the purple, and then I did a deep purple for my other yarn, and I'm making this into a headband, kind of like the one you saw at the beginning for my kiddo. So there you go. That's how you dye with yarn for animal fibers. Hopefully this was useful for you. Thanks so much for watching.